So good evening, everybody. I'm very excited that Orlene Weyland is here with us tonight to talk about her book, Hiding in Plain Sight, Bringing Our Jewish Family's Truth to Light. She's got a lot to share with us about her process, and I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. She published this personal account of uncovering her Jewish heritage and the tragic past of her family, shrouded in mystery for decades. Her research spanned 5 years in a relentless search for answers, taking her around the globe to places and meeting people she never could have imagined. The book weaves together the research detail with an extraordinary story of her family's unspeakable loss and desire to leave the past behind. So Orlene and I were chatting a little bit, and she is also a principal of Gallup's consulting firm, where she provides consulting to businesses with a focus on the employee assistance program. So she wears a few different hats besides author. So we're just really excited, Orlene, to have you tonight. So thank you
You.
so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Wonderful. Rachel, thank you so much for hosting tonight's discussion. And to everybody who's out there, thank you for dialing uh, in the evening. And as Rachel said, the idea that we have for tonight is for me to talk with you a little bit about kind of the how did this happen, the process, the story, and I certainly welcome any questions you have either about the story or about the research. It was a pretty wild 5 years. And in kind of a relentless way, which is part of my personality anyway. So that kind of worked well for me. But what you see here on the screen is the cover of the book. And these two lovely people are my mom and dad. The picture was taken in December of 1974, actually at my sister's wedding. It's a wonderful picture of them. And I have this picture in multiple places in my house, but just so you kind of get the idea of who they are, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Um, I think that uh, one of the real challenges in doing this research was unearthing despair, not just the despair of my family's, but my own, in these discoveries. But at the same time, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, it put the questions and the truth to rest, which from a personal point of view, was something I was hoping to be able to do if I could find out what happened to my family. And so I'm going to talk with you about the beginning. How did this happen? How did I find out that my parents were Jewish? The research, some later findings, and then, it comes up a lot in discussions with people is why a book? And what you see in front of you is a picture I took in 2016 on a road that led to the small town that my dad was born in Topolčany, Slovakia. And it was such a beautiful picture. And then at the end of that road was the town, and I have another picture of that, which was completely different. It was a town that really had kind of been almost forgotten in time, past the communist and Nazi regimes. There wasn't really much left, but it was another goal that I had. I wanted to go and see and maybe find even more information about my dad and his family. And as Rachel said, the book itself is a very personal book. I didn't start out deciding I was going to write a book. I'll talk about that later as well. But it really is a way for me to document not only facts and places, but also share with my own family. I have an adult daughter and three wonderful grandchildren. I really wanted them to know kind of who I am, who they are, and where their background sits. And really what began as this collection. And when I say collection, I mean piles and piles of things from research, um, really led me down this path I never could have imagined. One example I'm going to share with you, on my husband's 69th birthday, he had dinner in Slovakia. And when I said, "Did you ever expect to have a birthday dinner in Slovakia at all?" And, he said, well, it wasn't really on his list of places that he wanted to go for his birthday, but nevertheless, it was a memorable one as well. I want to share with you a very short chapter, the very first chapter of the book. I'm just going to read, which is the beginning of the journey. So you'll get a sense of where this started. Um, The journey started in 1994, so a long time ago, and it really took on a life of its own with a copy of a marriage certificate issued to my parents, Dr. Larry Allen and Eleanor Brom, back in 1949. The ceremony was performed on Henry Street in Lower Manhattan, for any of you who are familiar with Manhattan. And at the time, in 1994, mom was dying of early onset Alzheimer's disease. In the absence of a birth certificate required by the nursing care facility, I wrote to the New York City Department of Vital Records to request their marriage certificate, which would prove mom's date of birth. When I received the document a few weeks later, my eye was quickly drawn to the bottom right-hand section of the certificate, signed by Rabbi Zadel Epstein. I kept looking at the signature over and over again. I can remember standing in my kitchen looking at this, and I felt this sense of disbelief. But at the very same time, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, I also understood that this was their truth. But how could that be? How could that be? Mom and dad raised us. I have one sister. So we were raised in the Presbyterian Church. My sister and I were baptized in the Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church outside of DC. And we were both married, my first, her only, by that same Presbyterian minister in the 1970s. But there was never a mention of a Jewish heritage. It was never discussed. So that was kind of the catalyst for everything that came later. And sometimes people say, you began your research back in, give or take, about 2015. Why that time period? And while I spoke with others during those years, I began to read a lot about the Holocaust, because in high school, even, the discussion of the Holocaust in history class was pretty elementary. It really wasn't delved into at a very deep level. And so at the time, I was raising my daughter. I had a full-time career. I went back to grad school, so it was a pretty busy life. And we didn't have the online resources that we have today to be able to do research. So I feel very blessed to have had those as well. And as I'm talking, if you are thinking about questions, if you want to write them down, so that we can address all of them. So just to give you an idea, kind of a who's who, so have a better understanding of who I'm talking about. What you see in front of you is a very short family tree. To your left are my grandparents, Jakub Adler and Julius Schlesinger Adler. And when the name Adler actually is my real maiden name, it was changed in 1944 when my dad was in the British Army. It was changed to Allen. So that's the name that we used when we were growing up. Here's my dad. Larry Allen was the new name he took on. And he came with three siblings, two sisters and a brother whose name we didn't know. My dad told us he died in the war, and we don't really know exactly what that means. We have ideas about that. One sister, Blanca, who came to the US from Europe, and another sister, Kamila, who stayed in what was then Czechoslovakia during the war. So that's kind of his kind of brief tree. My mom on the other side, Eleanor Brom Allen, was daughter to Oscar Abraham Brum and stepdaughter to Irma Servos Abraham. Um, we also discovered in the research, I was able to find the birth record of my mother's biological mother as well. I was hoping to find out more, but that information was not available to me at all. So just so you have an idea, the picture you see in front of you is a picture of my parents from 1949. So I hope this helps just in terms of understanding the story. Um, the marriage certificate I mentioned earlier is here in front of you. And if you look on the left side, bottom right corner, you'll see the signature of the rabbi and all the other information that was required. But this was the document that fueled all of the research. It certainly was the document of discovery about my parents' past, although I will tell you, there were hints along the way. Uh, that at one point my sister asked my dad, because we both said, if you were born in Czechoslovakia, how could we have a surname like Allen? There are no names like that in that part of Europe, or very few, if there are any. And my sister, who was a little bit older, said, "Are you sure we're not Jewish?" And his response was, "Of course not. Don't be silly." So very clear that this was not going to be something that was going to be discussed, although certainly were hints along the way. But this really was the document that started this endeavor. And interestingly, on the right side where it asks for a country of birth, on my mother's side, it says Germany, and that was something we didn't know either. We were led to believe that she was born and raised in France. We didn't know she was born in Germany. And that's how I was able to get her birth record. Another thing I discovered in the research was every country has a different method for providing records. So in the case of Germany, you write to the city you write to the city where the person was born. When I went to get information about my dad in Slovakia, I had to go through the embassy. So it differs from country to country, but that was something I learned that I didn't know. So it's helped as I talk to other people who are doing research to share what I do know. Okay. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on the research. The rabbit hole is really what it became. And I just want to share with you some examples of documents that were discovered. The process itself was certainly not linear in any way. It was up and down and all over the place. I started the research thinking I could find information about my dad. And one of my major sources of information was the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in D.C. They were a wonderful partner. They were willing to meet with me in person with one of their researchers, and they had access at the time, it's probably different now, to digital records that even on their website, I as a user wouldn't have been able to locate. So their help continues to be appreciated. And I've also provided a list of sources and outcomes. If anybody's interested in those, I'm certainly happy to share them. But some of the documents actually started, the one thing leads to another to another. And I think in the research, one of the things I learned, and if you've done family research, you may have discovered the same thing, is that I'm using my brain in a way that I've really not used it. I'm asking questions about why. And I'm digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And with the online resources we have today, it certainly made that job a lot easier. One of the documents I discovered very early on is the um, manifest from the ship that my mom came over to the U.S. And the thing that the detail that led me to something else is where you see the yellow arrow. And you may not be able to see it, but what it says next to Eleanor Abraham is D of line 30. I couldn't figure out. I thought, well, what does that mean? So I called ancestry.com. This is where this information came from, where I did some of my research, and luckily was able to talk to somebody there and said, I don't know what this means. And she said, oh, it probably means that she's the daughter of the person named. And then, of course, what do you know? It's her stepmother. So she came here with her stepmother, who we knew something about, but not a whole lot as we were growing up. We were led to believe that my mom was raised by her father until she was 13. She said he disappeared at that time, was never to be seen again. So she was raised by her stepmother. And from what she said, it didn't sound like a particularly healthy relationship. You know, she talked about um, abuse. She talked about um, always trying to find her dad in a crowd, but Irma brought her here to the US, and then with Irma's second husband, George, my mom lived with them until she married my dad in 1949. So that that was a real help to me because it also showed me Irma's name is on the marriage certificate, Irma's name is on this. It just kept confirming what I already knew. And I found that to be very helpful because it helped me maintain a really solid inventory of who was who in this whole story. So Ancestry was also a great source of lots and lots of information, but this was one of the first, and these are not that hard to find, by the way, on Ancestry. Other things are much harder to find. Um, just want to make sure I didn't skip a slide. Just some other documents I wanted to share with you. What you see in the middle of the slide is actually the deportation list with my maternal grandfather's name on it, Oscar Abraham. I discovered through the Holocaust Museum that he was deported out of Drancy, France, and later on murdered in the concentration camp. And I want to share with you what my reaction was the day I found that out. And at some gut level, I probably knew, but until I heard it in somebody else's words, I felt like it had just happened. And I can remember sitting in my car and feeling as though I had lost somebody that I never knew. And so if you've ever experienced grief for someone you never knew, it's pretty overwhelming. Um, and and so that was, that was one of the first discoveries, which of course led to more and more and more. Um, what I also want to share with you is the document to the right. We're going to move on here to my dad's side. This document is a record of the years that my father's sister, Blanca, spent in 4 different death camps. Ultimately came to the US in the late 40s. The picture you see below is a picture of Blanca and her first husband uh, and Zoltan. And it was interesting because when she was in our lives as children, she referred to herself as being a widow. She had no children, but she talked about having a boyfriend here in the US. What I found with more research was that Zoltan as well was murdered by the Nazis. The document to the left is actually a letter um, that was written to my dad regarding his change of name to confirm that they had approved this. So Ladislav Adler in 1944 became Larry Allen, and Ladislav Adler was left never to be talked about again. And these are just a few. If you decide that you want to read the book, there's lots of other pictures and notations in the book because I think it's important to give the story life with pictures and people. Other things, and to your left, you're going to see a picture the picture, the black and white picture on the left is a picture of my dad that was discovered in 2015. Um, I did find one person in my research who had a live link to my parents. And I found that because I was wondering, as my Aunt Blanche had been part of our lives for some period of time when my sister and I were younger, and she lived in the Bronx, and I wanted to know whatever happened to her. And I discovered through research online that she had passed away, but she had passed away in Florida. So I wrote to the Florida Department of Records to ask for her death certificate. It came back, and you may or may not know that um, the states won't disclose cause of death unless the death is 50 years or more from the time that you're looking to find it. But what I did find was the name of what um, generally is the person who was responsible when somebody passes away. In many cases, it's a spouse, it could be a child. I saw a woman's name and it said it was my aunt's daughter. And of course, that kind of threw me into a tizzy because I thought, well, did my aunt have a child at some later date? Did she have a child in Europe? My mind was going in 100 different directions. So I wrote to this woman, Judith. Judith is her name. I wrote to Judith to tell her who I was and why I was looking for information. She lives in Vancouver. And what I got back 2 weeks later was a phone call from her telling me that she, in fact, was my aunt's stepdaughter. And the boyfriend, the one I mentioned earlier, that my aunt mentioned, was her father. So these two people had a very happy life together. My sister and I flew to Vancouver that fall, and Judith shared with us the contents of a box that she had found in my aunt's condominium in Florida. And my dad's picture was in this box. I don't know exactly what age he was at the time, but we'd never seen a picture of him at such a young age. So that was such a wonderful find. And next to him, that picture, um, actually at the time, um, is a picture of my grandson. And when my sister and I saw this picture of our dad, that's the first thing we said. It was almost eerie to see how similar they look. And my grandson was very happy to be included in the book. He was way too young at the time for me to talk to him about that story. Uh, but my sister and I thought that that was an uncanny resemblance that they had. What you see on the right side of your screen is just a picture of the town hall in Topolčany, Slovakia. Looks like a lot of other town halls. My husband and I went to Slovakia to do more research, and we were treated so beautifully by basically the town administrative employees who literally dropped everything they were doing to try to help me find more information. And I would say that about every other person I contacted, either by phone or by email or in person. I never had an answer of, no, I can't help you. People just stopped and said, let me see what I can do. Um, Other later discoveries, I'm going to talk just for a little bit more, and then I want to open this up to questions. Um, I was able to find documents and pictures of my aunt, as you can see, and other family members, and also gave us some clues to her relationship with our dad. And while I've mentioned that she was a pretty big part of our lives early on, somewhere in the early 1960s, that relationship between her and my dad um, was severed. We didn't really know why. At the time, we were living in California. We moved around a lot. My dad was a radiologist with the VA, and he was often able to kind of pick where he wanted to live, and he loved the idea of seeing this country that he referred to as his adopted country. Both my parents became citizens and were very proud to be Americans. Uh, and so we did a lot of trips back and forth, east-west to east-west, east-west. And we asked our parents what happened to, Aunt Blanche. We were old enough then, to be asking. And the one story they said was that she had threatened to expose my dad to the American government as being a communist. So, in those times, that was a very serious accusation. But what we also discovered was that at some time in the 1960s, we found documentation of a physical and mental health status that was performed on my aunt by a physician in Manhattan as a way for her to apply for restitution from the German government. Uh, so in talking with Judith about this, because I said, we don't really know why that relationship was severed. She said that her stepmother, my aunt, only spoke about my dad in terms of, he's very busy. She didn't really speak about him at all. And Judith didn't even know that me and my sister existed. She had no idea. So um, one of the other theories, though, is that part of that attestation is that you need someone to attest to the facts in this evaluation. With my dad being a physician and also her brother, Judith's thought was she may have asked for help and he may have said no because he would not want any discovery that he was Jewish. Both he and my mother did everything they could to keep that in the past. They both wore big gold crosses. Their best friends were actually our minister and his wife. And if you ask the question, it was only met with really an evasive answer. One of the other things, so we don't really know why that relationship was severed. And my sense is, as much as I don't like to give up on something, I don't think we'll ever know. But sometimes you wait long enough, the research resources get richer and richer, so it may be timing. So I'm not really willing to give that one up yet. We've also been curious about how my dad escaped Czechoslovakia in 1939. As you know, things were not going well at that time. He got out of the country and he joined the British Army, where he remained until he came to the US in the late 1940s. And we don't really know. There's some speculation that he may have been a spy, and not to be dramatic about that, but he spoke multiple languages and was incredibly intelligent. But we don't really know. There may have been someone in his family who could have influenced that. We don't really know. I did check actually with the Glasgow Department of Personnel to see if there was any information they had in his army records that would be able to tell me how he was able to get out. Unfortunately, they didn't have the information, but what they did send me from the archives was they called it a soldier's book, and it was probably not bigger than a passport. And it contained information about that person, their name, their height, their weight, their vaccinations, their clothing sizes, not particularly critical information. But the gentleman I was talking with over there sent me this soldier's book with a note that said, "This is collecting dust in the archives, better in your hands than in the hands of the government. This is going to mean more to you." So another example of someone who simply took another big step to really be helpful. And I still have that book. Another question that came up was the question of my mother's biological father. I had worked on the assumption that Oscar, her father, was her biological father, even when I knew that Irma, because my mom told me, was her stepmother. But what my mother told me was that she, my mom, was the product of the relationship between her father and his mistress. Not uncommon in Europe in those days, but that's really all I knew. And so when I when I got my mother's birth record from the city of Cologne in Germany, I went to a translating company here in Connecticut because it was all done in Old German, and I don't speak German, old or new. So, um, what it talked about was verifying my mother's date of birth, who her biological mother was. So I knew that. I knew her biological mother was single, of no known occupation. And then it spoke about her father and stepmother adopting her. And because there was a gap of a couple of years between when she was born and when she um, no longer lived in this kind of children's home, if you will. But at the same time, I had never heard the word adoption. So I couldn't then, and I haven't yet figured out, was my mother adopted by her father and stepmother, or was she adopted by her stepmother? So I don't know one way or the other. Um, if Oscar is her biological father, she represented him in that way. But it's entirely possible that she didn't know either. So that's another question, and that's one that really kind of gets at me. Um, because I would like to know. I did some research on her stepmother's family, um, of course, to discover that they too were murdered in the Holocaust, and that was the kind of the common answer that I got when I was in Slovakia. I was talking to these two lovely women in the town hall, and what I was really trying to find out was, where did my dad's parents go? Presumably they were still in Topolčany during the war, but I worked with a researcher at the University of Bratislava who was able to tell me their last known location in a town called Zelenia. So I said to these women, and we were with the help of a translator, I said to them, well, is it possible that my grandparents moved from Topolčany to Zelenia? And if I could describe the look on their faces, the two ladies looked at each other, they looked at me and my husband, and what they told me was that Zelenia was a holding place for Jews to be taken away for execution. And while I think I may have unconsciously known that, hearing that again, in for real, um, it, it was really like having like a brick kind of be hit over the head with a brick. It was one more family member that I never knew, but I was grieving for. And I can tell you, it's a very different kind of grief. Um, and so uh, those were some of the questions that did get answered. And I'll share with you this list of resources because it's a long, long list. I'm going to give you one other example because I think it's such a wonderful one. I wanted to find out more about my mother's stepmother. Uh, and so I went on findagrave.com and I found something at the Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens. If you're familiar with Queens, you know where Mount Hebron Cemetery is. But it was kind of strange because her name was listed as Irma George Miller, and it didn't make any sense. So I called the cemetery and said, I'm trying to find out information on Irma Servos. And they said they couldn't help me, but they gave me the name of a person at the Schwartz Funeral Home in Queens. I don't know if they're still there. So I put in a call and I spoke with a woman to say, I just want to confirm that in fact is my mother's stepmother who's buried in Mount Hebron. And she said, well, that was 20 years ago. It's going to take me some time. It's probably in the archives. 2 hours later, she called me back and she said, I can confirm that in fact is your mother's stepmother. And she's buried next to her husband, her second husband, George Miller. So hence that name. And so from a research perspective, if it looks a little funny, keep going because, mistakes get made in how information is um, transacted, whether it's online or otherwise. So if it feels a little funny, I wouldn't give it up. I wouldn't make that one go away. And in talking with this woman, I told her what I was looking for. I said, I'm wondering if maybe Irma and even her second husband know anything about my mother's um, biological mother or father. And she said, well, the best you can do is talk to the executor of her estate, but I can't give you that name because it's confidential. And I thought, okay, I mean, you have to be respectful of that. And she said, but what you can do is write a letter, send me the letter, and I'll forward it to them. So another example, again, of someone who really steps up. I sent her the letter, and we never heard back from the executor. But even with that, it was one more thing that I could say, okay, you need to put this aside for now because this is just going to go into a deeper rabbit hole. So those are just some of the questions. If I had 3 hours to talk to you tonight, I could tell you all the questions. And then one other thing is the why write a book? And I mentioned it earlier. I had promised the U.S. Holocaust Museum that any additional information I was able to find about my parents and their families, I would donate all that information, documents, if they didn't come from the museum, anything else. And as I did that, I really did think it looks like a book report. What about the people? So I need to write about my mom, my dad, my aunt, the people that I did know, and tell the story of these two people who met overseas, survived the horror show of the Holocaust in two very different ways, came to this country, put it all behind them, never told anybody that I know of, and were able to come together in a spirit of joy and happiness with each other, and then raise a family and live in this country in the way that our country was founded. And so you never saw two more patriotic Americans. They got married on July 5th. And of course, the story was it was because the courts were closed. They told us they were married by a justice of the peace. And of course, we know that's not true. They were married on July 5th by a rabbi. They were also married. They were also married in that Presbyterian church that I mentioned in DC, where my sister and I were baptized by that same minister. I was 5 and my sister was 8. I don't have a huge recollection, but they were also married in that church. And that was probably 5, 6 years after they were married by this rabbi. So they clearly wanted to put this behind them, and took on, um, took on the face of Christianity. Although there were times, my mother would say things that didn't really make sense. I mean, in terms of looking back, and she would say, don't have milk with your salami sandwich. And I didn't really know what that meant. And other things like that. Actually, somebody in a group I did last year asked me if I had had any culinary hints growing up, about the fact that my parents were Jewish. And I certainly did, in retrospect. I just want to quickly share, and again, you're welcome to have these. Um, it's two slides of all of my sources, people that I talk to. Some of these you pay a fee for, some you don't because people are really helpful. You do pay a fee to get public records, or if you want to sign in for Ancestry, Jewish Gen, Yad Vashem is an excellent resource for finding information about the Holocaust. And then on the next page, some of this was personal, things that were discovered in my dad's safe, his medical school records, information that said in black and white that he was Jewish. Um, and I've spoken to one Holocaust survivor who happened to come from Topolchani, so we thought there might be connection. Her daughter, who, as it turns out, I went to high school with. That was total karma that happened that way. She lives in Forest Hills, and her daughter was kind enough to act as facilitator because her mom, as you can imagine, was elderly and had some challenges in terms of communication. The personal visits, the traveling, uh, those were all places I had never imagined I would go to. So, even in addition to the book, the opportunity to go to these places and meet people who really have a common bond, who understood what I was experiencing at the time. So I'm going to stop there, Rachel. I want to make sure we have enough time if people have questions, either about the research or my family story. And there's a lot more detail in the book. It's impossible to cover that in 40 or 45 minutes because it is a little convoluted, to be quite honest.
I just want to ask a clarifying question about how this all started. So you mentioned the marriage certificate.
Uh-huh.
That your discovery of that is the first time that you really had any hint that what you had been led to believe was not true about their
Yes,
background.
that was really the confirmation.
Mhm.
It was really the confirmation.
And I'm sure, like you said, looking back in hindsight, pieces kind of came together,
Oh,
also being a kid. But when was that in your life that that happened? When you
1994 is
right.
when I found the marriage certificate, and then talked with friends, other friends, who were good enough to, bring me information and books about the Holocaust. And as I talked to them more about my background, one in particular, who I talk about in the book too, said, I know your parents they had to be Jewish. Based on everything you're telling me, it had to be.
And I talked to Orlene earlier before we started the program, and I just want to let everybody know that I will send out the list of sources for everyone. But you do have access to ancestry.com through the library with a library card. So you can get that information if any of you are interested in looking up some family history and some documents.